Alright everyone, welcome back. Video 5. On this video we're going to talk dependency injection, and I covered it a little bit in the last video at the end, but we're going to do the dependency injection with Angular, and we're also going to do a lot more now with the dependency injection with .NET and that side of things. Hopefully you enjoy, and let's get started. Flipping over to Visual Studio Code. We're just going to do a recap of what we kind of mentioned a little bit last time. The Angular CLI can generate different things, and we're going to generate real quick ng space g space, and we're going to make a service, and we're going to name our service test injection. I don't have a lot planned for what are we going to actually do with this service. So let's just generate it. The important thing to note is it just made it out here in our app folder where we did it. Now, the injectable here, that's saying provided in root, that's more or less making this class a singleton. So whenever any of the components in our website here that are in this module at the very least, whenever they reference this service, they're going to get the same instance of this class over and over. Maybe you're storing properties and maybe you're storing values that you want to share. I wouldn't necessarily say sharing too much like this between different components, but you can definitely use a service and have some interoperability between these components depending on the actual implementation that you're trying to do. There's definitely different ways to pass information back and forth between components that are a little bit cleaner, a little bit more, I'm just going to say quote unquote the Angular way. But I just want to kind of put it out there that anytime you have functionality that you want to share between these components, you can put it inside of a dependency injection service like this. So let's go ahead and do something pretty simple. We'll just do a method. We're going to call it test. We're not going to accept any parameters. It's not going to return anything. And inside of that test, we're just going to do console.log, and we're just going to say there was a test. All right. And that's pretty much all we have to do here. Now, because we did the provided in root, we don't have to go mention this inside of our app module. Now, if you didn't want this to be a singleton and you weren't doing this, you would have to then go reference it inside of your, let me go ahead and go to the right app module. You would put those inside the provider section here at the bottom, and it's an array that takes, any number of them. And then you would just reference it with test injection service, and this would be able to provide it to the components that are in this module. But I'm going to go ahead and backspace out that since we've left the provided in root here. So it's going to be available to all of the modules. Close that, and we don't need that anymore. So let's go back to our counter component. You can pick any component. Again, it could be any module that you're in. But if you want access to that, if you want to inject it, that new service into this component, then what you have to do is you have to put it as an argument on this parameter on this first this constructor. So it doesn't matter the order of them or anything else, but as long as they're a parameter here on this constructor, what we want to do is we want to say, I guess first we'll just say I'm going to make it private because I only want it to be available to this TypeScript section here. It doesn't need to be available to anything else. And we'll just name it test service. And what's the type of this test service? Well, it's a test injection service. Now you can see that I've been doing, a lot of tabbing and stuff. I'm making use of the tools we have available, but if you just partially type it and you see that it finds it in the list, and I'll just go back. If you hit tab, it'll go ahead and finish populating that for you, as well as bring in the required line of code up here that tells it that this module or this class here, this service, is found inside of this file. So make sure that if you're not using IntelliSense or if it's not working for you, make sure you add this line here. Anytime you're going to reference anything, not just these services, any components and classes that are being referenced, you have to import them like this into another class. All right, so now we've got this class reference and it's being injected into our components. So what do we want to do with that? Well, let's just say we'll go ahead and do this in the increment counter method that's hit when the button is pushed. And we'll just say this.testService.test, and we'll call that method. Okay, and start our debugging. And as soon as it pops up for me, I'll show you. Okay. Now I'm going to go ahead and just so we can see this all at one screen, you could look at your debug console in Visual Studio Code as well. But I'm going to hit F12 inside of the browser just to open up the debug console. If it's not showing for you, just click these little arrows and pick console in the list. These developer tools in the browser are very useful. I probably use them more than the debug console in Visual Studio Code. I prefer to look at my .NET code here and that, and then I prefer to look at my console code here, but it's just a preference thing. Maybe you don't like that this takes up some of the room, and of course if you have a responsive website, you know, you could be stuck looking at something different. So if we go to the counter page, now again, in this component, this counter component, we injected the service, and inside of that test service, we just did a log, which just says that the injected method was hit. So we'll just click the button, and you can say that there was a test showed up here in our module, and that logging came from the testinjection.service.ts. So it worked as we expected, and if we keep hitting it, you'll see that it keeps showing up here over and over. Or if you're back in Visual Studio Code, you can see that it's showing up down here in our debug console. And of course, I hit it 7 times, so you see the 7 next to it. And that is dependency injection in Angular. It does get slightly more complicated, but 99% of the time, 90% of the time, 95% of the time, what we've just gone through is all you're going to need to do. Now there is scenarios where you don't want the singleton, like I said, or maybe you want to leave it with as the singleton, but maybe you've got some properties that you want to pass in. And you know, I guess that would be a good thing to talk about right now. We're not doing a module, but if you were writing your own module and you wanted to pass in some properties and stuff like that, and maybe get a different instance of the service for that specific configuration, maybe you would do something. But again, 99% of the time, until you really get into some more advanced scenarios, just doing it as we've done it is the way to go. There's no reason to start providing different instances of it all over the place. If you're writing, you know, stateless code, or if you're writing stateful code, again, you know, you're going to want that singleton. You're going to want that same instance of it to be used all over the place. So if you're not writing stateless code, it doesn't hurt to have the singleton either way. So that's the Angular service, dependency injection. That's all you would want to inject is these services. And now let's focus a little bit more on the .NET side of things. So that was the client side DI. DI just means dependency injection. And now we want to look at the server side of things. So on the .NET side of the house, it's going to be a little more complicated to set up our initial service, but just follow me and we'll get through it. So inside of the websites, let's just go ahead and make a new folder. And inside of this, I'm just going to name it services. Again, we'll probably end up going with a different structure if you follow the series, but this is just going to keep it out here unnested for you guys for now. So inside of that, we'll go ahead and do a new file. And what are we going to name this service? Well, let's pretend like we had a bunch of stuff in place for logging. Well, we already have a logger service that's being injected, so that wouldn't be the best example for you guys. Let's just keep it simple with the same kind of scenario. So we'll do a test service.cs, and namespace, of course, we need to define, and it's just going to be in website.services. And then so we have a public class. Our class is called test service. We don't have any interfaces that we're using or anything else like that for now. Now, we're not decorating this with injectable or anything like that. And that's going to be one of the key differences that we're going to have to address in a different part of this code. So we don't necessarily need a constructor, but I just always end up writing one. And then let's go ahead and do a test method. So we'll say public void test. And if you're still learning C# and you're still learning the ECMAScript stuff, the JavaScript side, then having these two different languages, it might get kind of confusing, and maybe this scenario is really to it. Maybe you don't want the .NET APIs yet. Maybe you want to do something that's also on the JavaScript side of the house with your APIs. But if you're willing to, if you know the two languages and you want to stick with it, I think it's definitely worth it. But there could be some confusion, and even in this video series, you're going to see me typing, a different order for the types and the variable names, and you'll see all sorts of different things, but it's very similar. We just have, again, we don't have to make it public, but we have the return type on this side of it, whereas on the JavaScript side, we had test, and again, IntelliSense doing what I don't want it to do, and we had void like that. So it's similar, but slightly different, and I guess more I'm talking about TypeScript when I keep saying JavaScript and stuff like that, because TypeScript is what's making it so close to the C# style for us. And inside of our test method, well, this is an opportunity to show you that you can inject stuff into stuff that will then be injected into other stuff. There can be whole chains of this dependency injection. Now, you do have to watch for a circular dependency injection, which would be you try to reference something that in its chain tries to reference back to the first one. And if that's the case, you're going to get errors because that chain of dependencies wouldn't be valid. So it has to be, there is a strict kind of process, going on here. But as long as you aren't trying to do a reference back along the line, like what I'm going to inject here is, let's go ahead and just do that so I can talk about it. So we will do, I'm not in JavaScript here, so what we're going to do is we're going to do the name. No, I got confused. So we will do an iLogger, and this is a service that's being injected. Well, we're referencing the interface to that implementation, to that service, but there's another service that's being provided by Microsoft in this case. That's an abstraction, and I think it's using Serilog or something like that. We can check in our references in a bit, but what you need inside of this is a type. So the type for our iLogger is test service. And this is important that you have the right type here. Now, it would let you type any type here, so we could do logger with some other class. We could do program, for the program.cs. But what would happen is in our output, and we'll flip back over here to the node launch stuff. So this is some of our previous output. What the type that's being shown here in the log before the level and the message, that whole namespace there is going to come out as what's the namespace in the type that we specify here in the the logger here. So you want to make sure that you got the right logger for the right type, or else you're going to get messages that don't make sense to you in the logs. So make sure that's correct, and we'll just say that this is the logger. And unfortunately, the .NET side of the house doesn't let you just reference it from having used it in that constructor. So we're going to actually have to make a field here, but we'll just make a field called logger, and we'll assign it the logger. And of course I've got an error, but I'm going to use the IntelliSense. That's not the right button. I'm going to use the IntelliSense, and if you want, you can click this little light bulb here, and you can hit to generate the field, or you can do like me, and depending on your hotkey setup, you can hit Control with the period, and that will go ahead and it'll be the same thing as clicking the light bulb. And what we want to generate is just a field called logger. No problem. And we could even make it read only, because nothing else should be able to set this logger after the constructor. All right, perfect. Now inside of our test method, we could just do something like, say, logger. We'll do log information, and we'll say the C#. And let's go ahead and just do some things so we can talk about. We'll use some string interpolation here. And we'll just say, so the C# method, and what we'll do is we'll say name of, and we'll put our type in here. So we'll put the name of our method in here. So we'll do name of test. And it's better, I could have just wrote test here, but especially when you're doing something like logging, maybe you're copying and pasting an exception block, which happens all the time. You don't want to have that hard-coded test in here, and you forget that it's even there because you're in the zone, and you just copy and paste it into another area, which is, we all know that's a big part of development, is just copying and pasting stuff you already wrote. So we'll go ahead and do like this. So if we happen to copy and paste this into a different class, this code here would be highlighted, and well, let's just do it. Well, I'll get the logger here as an issue, but what it would do was it would be an instance to tell you, hey, I can't compile because I don't know what this is. What's this name of thing that you're talking about here? But if you have it like this, it works just fine. So we'll do C# method of test was called. Okay. Now we actually need to use this service somewhere. So in order to be able to use this service, and again, like I mentioned, in the Angular side of things, we had that inject in the root part that was up here decorating the class. But here we don't have something like that that we can provide. So we're going to have to go into our program.cs. And again, if you follow this project in series, we definitely would be cleaning up, adding things out here into some sort of a startup helper or something like that. But the program.cs is what's going to actually be run when your website's starting up. And this is where we're going to tell it about these injectables. So in order to do that, what do we have here? We have app.services. And what we can do is we can do nothing in this services because it is a service provider. So what we need to do is go up a little higher, and we're not going to do it under app. What we would do is we would do builder.services.add, and for the most part, there's, again, like I talked about with the Singleton and stuff like that with the client side of it, we have some different options here. So we have add transient, which is in most scenarios a safe one to use because it gives a different instance, and especially because with the client, we were dealing with one person doing one thing at a time, maybe doing multiple things at a time, but we have one client that our whole context is based around this one person doing things. There can only be one. But on the server side of it, the .NET side of it, you're going to have lots of different clients connecting and talking to the server at the same time. And the server needs to have different instances of these services going most of the time. So most of the time, you're going to go with add transient. And all you need to do to make this test service available is we're going to come in here, we're going to type test service. I'm going to hit control with the period, or you can click the light bulb that shows up on the screen. And it didn't give us anything here. And that's because, again, I'm not too familiar with this whole format here with not needing the whole program class here, but what we can do is add a using statement up here for website.services. And okay, unfortunately, when I wrote my services class, let's go back to it. You can see I actually had a typo here in the namespace. So I had services and we needed services. So let's go back over here and tell it that the correct namespace that we want to use is services. And this should actually be working. And of course, I have a typo there as well. All right, so I will explain some of the different scopes. Let me just get them out on the screen real quick. This wouldn't be valid to add one service all three ways, but we have add scoped and we have add singleton. And we've kind of talked about singleton the most so far, since that's pretty much the way that the client side was doing them, like I said. And the singleton is fine as long as everybody can have access to that same class at the same time. Multiple users got to be able to call this thing. So if you're saving any sort of state at all in properties and stuff like that, you can't be using singletons to do those kinds of dependency injection, because then one user's request will be overriding another user's request, and you will get yourself into a whole mess that you just don't even know where to start finding the problems that will start showing up. So I would say if you don't need the singleton class, if you don't need that one instance shared between everybody, don't bother with the singleton here. So I'm going to say that's a no 95% of the time. Now there's valid reasons to do it, 100%, but most of the time I would say it's wrong. So we have two more. Let's go down them in this order because that's kind of the order of most, I guess least to most. So we have the singleton, that was one, and now we have scoped. So what is scoped? Let's think about the website API thing here. So each request that comes in for a website API, that start of the request would, if somebody asked for it, the first time it was asked for, it would create an instance. And if any other classes asked for it during that same API call, they would all get the same instance of it. So we've kind of gone to where all users and all requests get the same one, to now not all users, but each request is getting its own version. And by request I mean like HTTP request to us. So the API is called, and all of the code until we return some value back to the client to say that here's the API data that you asked for. It's all going to get the same service. So it's kind of like, you imagine it's like the Singleton, but just for that HTTP request and just for that one user's HTTP request. So it's definitely safer because other users won't be overriding the data inside of the state here. But I would still say that this is probably my least used one. Now, it's, again, perfectly valid. Just think about what I said. It's from one HTTP request till the end of the HTTP request. There's plenty of reasons to do something like that. But you have to be careful when you're mixing the scope, you can't really add a scope service might not be able to add, well, I guess a transient service wouldn't be able to have any of the services that have been set up as transient. I don't think they would be able to reference the scope or vice versa. Like there's some rules in place as far as the dependency injection goes that does not want you mixing the scopes. So most of the time I've gone with transient, and I'll explain what that is next. I've gone with transient, I've stuck with transient, and I haven't had performance issues with it or anything like that. So I would just recommend that it's going to be the easiest to avoid issues with. And the reason why that is because what transient is that anytime a class tries to inject this service into it, it's going to get its own instance of it. And most of the time I try to avoid writing code that has a bunch of state in it in the first place, meaning properties are being saved between different calls and different pieces of code and stuff like that. So for the most part, I go with the transient service, and I would say stick with this one unless a need comes up to switch to a different one. So again, the add transient means that anytime a class asks for the test service, they're just getting their own instance. It doesn't matter if it's the same HTTP request, the same user, different user. Every class that asks for it is getting a different instance of it. And that's the general setup for the .NET side of the dependency injection. So let's go to it. Now let's find something that we can inject our test service into. Now again, I referenced in our test service, remember we said that we were going to inject an iLogger, and if we look inside of this program code, you're not going to see anything that says to add a transient iLogger. What's going on with that? Well, there's some code that's happening behind the scenes. I think in this particular scenario, it happens somewhere in this website.create builder, potentially with this add controller with views, but it may even be inside of that SPA proxy library. I don't believe that's the case, but it's happening somewhere in one of these two steps most likely, and you're free to browse the code and see where it's actually happening at. But I think it has something to do with the create builder that's going on here and the arguments that are being passed in by something. Okay, so again, our logger is injecting the test service into it, and what we can do is just to have a chain of things happening. What we can do is, even though the weather forecast controller has its own logger, and you definitely want to keep it having its own logger, we're going to we're going to add an import for that new service. So we're going to say test service. And again, we don't have a reference yet, but we're just going to say test service. And then let's go ahead and bring it in. So I'm going to hit control with the period. And I really need to use Visual Studio Code more or get a different plugin, because it's unfortunate that it doesn't seem to want to add namespaces. Maybe I forgot a plugin or something. But what I'll do is manually I'm going to type in the namespace of where our service was, which was website.services. And here, and apparently I keep doing a typo with service for some reason. So maybe that has to do with, let's see if we can't get the IntelliSense to behave now that we're actually typing the right name. Control period, there we go. So it's because I had some typos going on, but if you do the control and period or you hit the light bulb, and you should be able to do using services like that instead of having to come up here and type those. All right, so we've got it. Now we actually have to store it for later. So we'll just say test service. And I don't know why all of my services have had typos in them, but test service, go. And you can see it's underlined, which means we don't have it yet, but I'm going to go ahead and generate that field. Perfect. And now we can call that here in this. I'm going to go ahead and replace this logging call so it doesn't get confusing. And what we'll do is we'll say test service dot, and I guess I didn't make the method public, which I didn't. So we can do public like this. I believe internal should work as well. But here we go. And we have test. So if you recall, what we did was now our weather forecast API is getting an instance of the test service, and the test service is getting an instance of its own logger, just the same way that this forecast API is still getting its own logger as well. And again, it's perfectly fine to have these loggers being injected everywhere because you want a new instance of them created everywhere with the correct type that's going to actually put the right namespace out here in the logs. So again, our test service has a logger being injected into it. It has a method called test, which is then going to call the logger.log information. And I guess I'll just show it to you one more time. And you can see it says that the C# method of the name of this method here, test, was called. So we'll go back to the weather API and we'll just save any open changes. And since we're changing server-side code here, we're going to have to stop the debugging that we had going and start a new one. Okay, some services are not able to be constructed. Enter exceptions found. No suitable constructor for the type. Test service could be located or could not be located. So let's see if maybe we had a typo inside of there. iLogger, test service, logger. It seems okay to me. Did I have a typo here? No? Oh. Again, because I've been doing so much of the JavaScript, I actually didn't make that constructor public, so it wasn't available to dependency injection. Your constructors have to be public if you want them to be used, which is, something you're going to need for dependency injection and stuff. So again, having the constructors, if you know you don't need a constructor, you're already at a point where it's fine to decide what you want to do. But if we weren't injecting anything into this here and we weren't putting a logger into it, well, then we wouldn't need to define a constructor at all, and it would just be assumed that there's a public constructor with no parameters. But we actually have a constructor with parameters, and we're not going to allow this service to be created unless this logger can be passed into it. So this is the only constructor we want at the moment. But again, we'll try to start our debugging again. And I think my browser is ready. There we go. And we'll just wait for this to finish. All right, now we've got our console at the moment, and I can tell it's on the client side stuff, so I'm going to switch it over So we're looking at the .NET side of things, and then I'm going to go back to the website. Now what we did was we called all this new service inside of the API for the weather. So if I go to fetch data on the website, looks like it errored out and said weather forecast not found. And the reason why is I believe it was in a different video. What I did was I changed it so that the APIs here all had API in front of them. And unfortunately, I did not match that change inside of the fetch data page. So here where it's making its request, I forgot to add a API in front of that. Hopefully you're from a different video and that makes sense, you know, why we did that change, but if you're just joining us, you don't need to worry about that. You haven't gotten that error in your code. I'm just waiting for the browser to show back up. Okay. All right, we'll try it one more time. Hopefully it actually works. We'll go to fetch data, and if we go back to Visual Studio and we look at the loggers here, what do we have? I don't see the related logging going on, which is surprising. We didn't get any errors, we know that. So what's happening here? Let's take a look real quick. Well, we're logging at the information level. Let's go into our app settings. I guess we're in development at the moment. Nothing defined in there. Weather forecast says it's willing to show debug, but it's, oh, again, because the logging that's actually going to happen here is actually in a different namespace than the weather forecast. Remember, this is in our test service. We had it limited to just show warnings or higher. So for our website, for now, on the server-side stuff, we want to show debugging at the debugging level or not. So I'm going to stop it. I'm going to start it all back up. And once my browser is ready, we'll pop over there. Okay. Now, making a lot of changes and having to restart and having it affect the Angular CLI starting and stopping, that's what's taking so long here. The .NET part of itself was ready a long time ago. So in production, you know, you're not, well, I guess you're not making changes like this in production at the same time, but once you're done making the majority, like a bulk, you know, .NET backend changes at a time, you're not really stopping, and this CLI part of it's not normally part of what you're testing anyway. So, but we are, and we're going to go to fetch data, which is the API call here. And if we switch back to the debugging console, you can see now that we actually have the logging levels not filtering out information. You can see that the website services test service has an information logged, and it says the C# method test was called. Perfect. So again, just to kind of recap that again, the weather forecast controller injected the test service right here in the constructor. And if we go to the test service has a logger being injected into it. And when that test method was called, it used that logger. So we have a chain of dependency injection that's happening. And for the most part, like I said, the only way to really mess this up is to try to mix the scopes up or to have a circular dependency going on, which is, it'd be maybe the same as if the weather forecast controller, or let's just say we have this, let's say we had our own custom logger service. If we were trying to inject the logger service into the test service, And inside of the logger service, we were trying to get a copy of the test service. That's a circular dependency. There can't be it's literally, if you were to draw a circle with these and lay them out like that, they would go back to the start again. You can't have a reference further down the line that tries to get an instance of something higher up on the food chain. So just keep that in mind. Other than that, that is really the bulk that you need to know about dependency injection on the .NET side of the house. Earlier in the video, we covered the dependency injection that fits 90% of the scenarios for the client side of the house. And that's it for dependency injection. Hopefully you learned a couple of things. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave them in the comments. And I appreciate you guys watching. See you in the next video.